Russia's war in Ukraine is increasingly turning into a strategic nightmare for both Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. Because while state media still talks about inevitable victory, the reality looks very different today. Because the Russian economy is under immense pressure. Strategically important targets deep inside Russian territory are being hit by Ukrainian drones and missiles, and at the front line there are no decisive breakthroughs for the Russian army, only a grinding attrition and staggering losses for Russia. But the most interesting part, behind the official rhetoric of triumph, Moscow appears to be preparing not for victory, but for damage limitation in the inner circle. So the real question today is, what steps does Putin have to take now? And why could exactly these steps be interpreted as clear signs of growing weakness inside the Russian Federation? That's exactly what we are going to talk about today. Hi, my name is Alexander Kortan. I'm a strategic analyst and media manager from Austria, and I'm also the founder of the German YouTube channel GEOPOL. And today we want to take a closer look about the latest steps of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. Because if you listen to Russia's chief propagandists, the narrative hasn't changed much. Most Russians still say victory is inevitable and the West is collapsing and Ukraine is on the brink. And officially the Kremlin still insists that all war objectives will be achieved soon. And at the beginning of February 2026, for example, former Russian president and current Security Council official Dmitry Medvedev publicly claimed that a military victory in Ukraine would come soon. And according to him, the decisive task would then be to prevent wider conflicts. But outside of Putin, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Medvedev, the tone has shifted noticeably. And even some of Russia's most loyal television figures are no longer able to fully ignore the economic realities. One of the most prominent examples is Vladimir Solovyov, arguably the Kremlin's most aggressive chief propagandist in television. Because for years Solovyov spoke not only about defeating Ukraine, but about confronting the entire West, and he fantasized about Russian troops marching to Berlin, Paris or even Vienna. And yet, in recent broadcasts, his tone has become darker, because instead of promising grand offensive, he has openly complained about the worsening economic situation. And he described businesses closing in Moscow, empty new housing blocks across the country, and growing financial problems among ordinary citizens. And he even mocked the terminology, criticizing how authorities avoid words like recession and instead use phrases such as technical slowdown. Now, of course, it would be easy to dismiss Solovyov as just another loud television personality without real power, but that would be a mistake, because Solovyov is not alone today. And increasingly, Russian officials and economic insiders are publicly warning about serious financial risks. Reports in outlets such as Fortune have highlighted growing concerns inside Russia that the country could face a severe financial crisis as early as summer 2026. And that is because oil revenues are declining, war expenditures are continuing to rise, and the fiscal gap is widening. And even members of the State Duma have started to acknowledge the strain. And one deputy chairman of the Duma's Economic Policy Committee warned that the federal budget is missing trillions of rubles and predicted a sharp industrial contraction in 2026. He especially criticized high interest rates, heavy taxation and what he described as the concealment of real inflation levels. And according to him, both businesses and citizens are already beginning to withdraw significant funds from the banking system. And exactly this is where things get truly dangerous for the Kremlin. Because when inflation rises and interest rates remain extremely high, companies and households struggle to service their loans. And as a result of that, non-performing loans in the banking sector increase even further, and Russian analysts have reported a rapid rise in overdue loans, credits that are more than 90 days past due. And if the trend continues, the share of problematic assets in the banking systems could exceed critical thresholds. And even a Kremlin analyst center has warned that Russia could face a systematic banking crisis by October 2026 if these dynamics accelerate. and according to their assessments, preventing such a collapse might require the restructuring or nationalization of a significant portion of Russian banks or massive state support equivalent to several percent of the GDP, in real numbers 2%. So, in other words, the risk of a banking collapse is no longer theoretical, and the Kremlin knows it. And when a banking system begins to wobble, the greatest threat is not just insolvency, it is panic. A real bank run can destroy even institutions that might otherwise survive. And this is why over the past year, Russia has quietly laid the legal groundwork to limit citizens' access to their own money. Because under the pretext of fighting fraud and terrorism, authorities introduced stricter controls on transfers and cash withdrawals. So banks were granted expanded powers to block transactions or freeze accounts deemed suspicious. Officially in the Kremlin, this is all about security and fighting against fraud. But unofficially, it provides the government with a powerful tool. In the event of a bank run, authorities could classify large-scale withdrawals as suspicious and effectively restrict access to liquidity. That, of course, would slow capital flight and buy time, but it would also signal deep insecurity at the highest levels. Because a regime that is confident in imminent victory does not prepare emergency mechanism to lock down private savings. And this pattern also extends beyond the financial sector. Because also communication is now increasingly centralized and restricted inside the Russian Federation, and independent platforms such as Telegram or Instagram are under pressure. Internal social media services have been limited or blocked, and even widely used messaging apps such like Telegram have faced disruptions or restrictions inside the Russian Federation. At the same time, the Kremlin promotes state-controlled alternatives like the messenger Max, encouraging citizens to rely on domestically monitored platforms. And this is not simply about wartime censorship, it reflects a strategic shift. Because if a government believes it is on the verge of military triumph, it prioritizes efficiency, better coordination, better communication and economic resilience. But what we are seeing instead is the construction of an internal control architecture, one designed to monitor information flows and, if necessary, shut them down. Because in a scenario where economic instability meets political frustration, communication becomes the decisive variable. And if citizens can freely exchange information, compare narratives and discuss economic realities, dissatisfaction can evolve into coordinated action. But if communication channels are fragmented, monitored or restricted, organizing opposition becomes significantly harder. And all this matters especially in the context of the economic strain. Because declining revenues, rising war costs, high interest rates and growing credit defaults create a fragile mix. And historically, such combinations have often preceded structural crises. And when banks come under pressure, liquidity tightens, and when liquidity tightens, trust erodes. And when trust disappears, even a system that appears stable on paper can enter a downward spiral. And this is why measures like transaction monitoring, withdrawal limits and digital centralization must be seen as interconnected parts of a broader strategy. Because they give the state the ability to freeze capital movements, they allow rapid intervention in the banking system, and they also reduce the risk of coordinated protests. So we can see the shutdown of Telegram inside the Russian Federation is part of this broader strategy to prevent possible protests in the upcoming months. But we have to be clear, because every one of these steps also send a signal. Because stable, self-confident regimes preparing for victory do not need to shield themselves from their own population. They do not need to prepare for bank runs or restrict communication at such a scale. All these measures are defensive measures, and defensive measures suggest that the leadership sees internal risks growing. And meanwhile, the military situation remains one of attrition rather than breakthrough. And despite continuous offensives, Russia has struggled to achieve decisive victories at the front line. And Ukraine, on the other hand, continues to strike infrastructure and strategic targets far beyond the front line, and the war that was supposed to be swift has turned into a prolonged conflict, draining resources year after year. And time today is not neutral, because every additional month increases fiscal pressure on the Russian Federation, and every wave of mobilization strains the labor market, and every sanction compounds technological isolation. So the Kremlin's response, however, is not structural reform or de-escalation, it is consolidation, and more state control over finance, more oversight over communication, and more centralization in civilian sectors. So for the Russian population, this means gradual isolation, technologically, economically and informationally. And this isolation has two effects. First, it reduces direct comparison with external realities. But secondly, it increases dependence on state-control narratives. And in authoritarian systems, information control is often the final line of defense when economic performance falters, because prosperity can legitimize power, but if prosperity declines, control must be compensated. So when we look at the broader picture, the fiscal warnings, the rising non-performing bonds, the legal preparation for liquidity restrictions, the tightening grip over communication, we do not see a regime in triumph mode or in victory mode. Today in Russia, we see a regime fortifying itself against internal instability. And historically, such preparations rarely signal strength. They signal anticipation of turbulence. And the Kremlin may still speak of inevitable victory, state television may still project confidence, but policies reveal priorities, and priorities suggest that Moscow is preparing for far more uncertain future than it publicly admits. And the steps taken by Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin suggest one thing very clear. The Russian Federation and the Kremlin is not the strong superpower it suggests to be. The Kremlin is now a weakening regime, and it knows it is weakening. So the weakness of the Russian Federation is already visible today, and in the coming months these weaknesses will further increase. But of course, now it's your turn, and I'm interested in your opinion. Do you think that the last few steps of the Kremlin suggest the weakness for the Russian Federation? And what do you think? How long can this system still survive in Moscow? Let me know in the comments. I will of course enjoy reading them. Otherwise, I will end the video here. If you found this video informative and helpful, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel GEOPOL Global. Otherwise, as I said, I will end the video here. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.